Back in the mid-90s, most gamers had either a PlayStation or a Nintendo 64, but not a lot of people wanted a Sega Saturn by comparison. Well, it turns out the Sega Saturn was a good console with some good games, so now a lot of people have changed their minds. And because not very many of us bought a Sega Saturn and therefore its games, that stuff is now in short supply, and combined with high demand, yup, you guessed it, it's expensive. Whoops. Now, this is no recent phenomenon, as the Saturn has always had a reputation for being expensive as long as I've been collecting. So naturally, a question many gamers ask themselves is, should I collect Sega Saturn games? And then if they do want to, they may be then wondering, how the hell do I do it? I think a lot of gamers just jump to the conclusion that they need to either ignore the Saturn entirely or take out a second mortgage on their home if they do want to collect for it. However, there's a ton of flexibility in between those two extremes, with a lot of different options for experiencing the console as well as different options for collecting for it. And of course, I'm going to be going over all of this with a handful of tips and tricks along the way. You've come to the right guy. Okay, so first things first, which is to figure out if you like any of the games or not. Well, if you're a fan of Sega games, then it's hard to imagine you wouldn't. However, maybe you look at the Saturn and think, wasn't that a console that came out right when games transitioned from 2D to 3D? I hate early 3D games, screw this shit. Well, the thing about the Saturn is it was the console from its generation that was most reluctant to let go of 2D games. This was represented well by the controller for the console, which is the best controller for 2D games ever made, according to myself and many others. Anyways, when it comes to Saturn games, there are 4 different categories of games that I notice people gravitating towards, so see if any of these make your ears perk up. Number 1, some of the best 2D fighting games made by Capcom and SNK. Number 2, 2D shoot 'em ups, also some of the best ever made. Number 3, mid-90s Sega arcade games that sure were in 3D but had that great pick up and play quality to them. And number 4, original Saturn games by Sega that were typically very unique. If any of that sounds appealing to you, then the Saturn may be up your alley. Okay, so let's start with figuring out a way to play these games. YouTube videos of gameplay can give you a general idea, but ideally you would want to play the games yourself, right? Typically the obvious solution to this is to emulate, but the Saturn has earned a reputation over the years as being notoriously difficult to emulate. Well, I'm glad to say that it's gotten much easier over time. It's not nearly as tough as it used to be. Some people would even tell you that it's downright easy. I know for some of you trying to get an emulator set up and configured, it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, they said this was easy, but here I am hours later still trying to figure this out, and I'm ready to hurl my laptop out the window. I get that, and it should be noted that emulating CD-based consoles has always been slightly more involved than emulating cartridge-based consoles. But I know a lot of my viewers are tech-savvy individuals. You can always look up a tutorial, and I'm sure lots of you could figure it out. Also, the Saturn is home to a ton of great arcade ports, so there's always the option to emulate the arcade versions of these games. That way you'd be dealing with arcade emulators, which are generally some of the easiest emulators to use. But say you're looking for a more official way to play these games, and you have a budget larger than $0, but not much larger. Well, it took a number of years after the Saturn's release, but finally a lot of its games have shown up on more modern consoles. Games like Radiant Silvergun, Guardian Heroes, Nights into Dreams, all some of the best games for the console, can be found on the Xbox 360 marketplace, and they're even backwards compatible with the Xbox One if that's what you got. We gotta talk about the Panzer Dragoon games as well. At the time of this video, the first game has been remade with the second game on the way, and the hope is that the granddaddy of all Saturn games, Panzer Dragoon Saga, will be remade at some point as well. Hopefully that's been announced depending when you watch this video. However, I should mention that the gameplay feel of the remake of the first game doesn't quite feel right compared to the original, though if Panzer Dragoon Saga ever gets remade, because it's a RPG with a somewhat turn-based battle system, I have faith that they'll be able to get the gameplay feel right. Okay, but what if you want to play Sega Saturn games on an actual Sega Saturn console with the original controller? Well, first I should quickly mention that if you're using an emulator, you can use an official Saturn controller with it by just getting an inexpensive Saturn to USB adapter. Anyways, if you want to play Saturn games on the original hardware, one of the cheapest options that has gained popularity in recent years is to just burn your games. Yes, that's right, you can burn game discs, but you'll need something extra before you do so. Perhaps one of the most straightforward methods is to just get a cartridge with pseudo Saturn on it, which can easily be found online. Plug that sucker into the cartridge slot on your console and you're good to go. You can even just mod your system if you're savvy enough, and even take it a step further with another mod that allows you to just load games onto an SD card that you plug into your Saturn and play them that way. Again, I understand modding isn't an option for everybody, but if it is, there's a bunch of different setups you can use. Okay, but now what about if you want to play actual official game discs on your console? You know, so that you can actually collect the games? Well, this is where you can run into trouble, since a lot of Saturn's most highly coveted games can be expensive, and I mean really expensive. However, there is still one trick I strongly recommend that can help you get around this for some games, though unfortunately not for every single game. The solution is buying the Japanese versions of these games, which are typically much cheaper. Luckily, it's very easy to play Japanese games on a Saturn, with the most straightforward solution being to buy one of these action replay carts that goes into the cartridge slot. Luckily, that cartridge comes with some extra benefits that come in handy as well, such as additional storage space, extra RAM, and even cheat codes for games. Now, the biggest thing to keep in mind is that while a lot of the Japanese versions of Saturn games do have some English in them that will allow you to navigate the menus, some of them don't, and for any games that have dialogue in them, it's probably going to be in Japanese. So for any games that have a story element in them, the Japanese version probably won't work unless you can read Japanese. The best advice I can give is to research a given game before you buy it. Look at YouTube footage of the Japanese version of the game and see if it's doable. You can typically find footage of the games where it is doable because gamers are excited to show that you can. One of the biggest examples people like to point to is Saturn Bomberman. Now, this is kind of tricky because the gameplay itself is totally playable in the Japanese version, but where you run into trouble is with the menus. Damn it, guess I'll have to shell out hundreds of extra dollars for the US version. Whoa, hold on a second. Or you could just print off the few menu screens of the English version that gamers have lovingly scanned and put on the internet to help out their fellow gamers. Then you just tuck those scans into your manual and it's ready to go every time you play the game. Bada bing, bada boom. Now, a few menus translated is manageable, but if it's anything more than that, like say, the entire game, like in Panzer Dragoon Saga, trust me, I know the price difference makes it tempting, but from what I've heard from others, it's a miserable experience. Maybe it's for some people, but I just can't recommend that in good conscience. I should also point out that the Saturn has a ton of Japan region exclusives that are worth looking into, and two of the genres that the Saturn is known for, being 2D shoot-'em-ups and 2D fighting games, are very playable in their Japanese iterations, since you don't really need to read any dialogue and most of the menus are in English. Also, some of you might be thinking, I don't want to have to buy games from Japan and deal with international shipping. Well, luckily playing Japanese games is so popular and common among Saturn enthusiasts that you can generally find listings from US sellers with Japanese copies of games. Also, don't forget the European PAL versions of games as an option either, especially since they're in English, though you do need to watch out for a handful of errors with certain games. You can find master lists online detailing which games have problems. And if you're wondering if there's any sort of affordable option for buying the US versions of games, I have one go-to recommendation that I like to bring up. At one point, Sega was giving away a 3-pack of some of its most popular arcade ports if you bought the system as a way to promote it. They come in these easily accessible sleeves, which I always thought were kind of cool since they're in line with the pick up and play nature of the games themselves. You got a racing game, a fighting game, and a shooting game, so it can be fun to have that variety and just easily swap between the 3 discs. Anyways, these are really affordable to find in these sleeves as opposed to the big Saturn cases, and I'm a fan of them. Okay, one other recommendation I'll throw out there is that if you have a friend who owns some of the more expensive Saturn games that you've wanted to try, maybe they'll let you borrow them. And then of course you can upgrade that into a permanent borrow by moving away without telling them, I live in another state, Steve, you'll never find me. That's obviously a joke. If somebody is nice enough to let you borrow one of these expensive Saturn games, then they're probably a really good friend that trusts you. So treat that game carefully and give it back in the same condition you got it so they don't have to stress about it. Maybe you could even let them borrow an expensive game you own to make it mutually beneficial. Alright, I think that about does it for all the tricks I can give for playing and collecting Saturn games. I went over a lot of different things, and so my hope is that some of these things will prove useful. Also, I just briefly went over some of the modding stuff that would require their own entire videos, which you can of course find on YouTube, but for the purpose of this video, it was just to let you know that those options do exist. If you have any specific tricks to share yourselves when it comes to Sega Saturn, then I'd be curious to know, but I would also be interested in knowing what your personal feelings about the Sega Saturn are. Do you like it, collect it, play it, not give a crap? Has my video perhaps convinced you to consider it? I've always thought of the Saturn as a bit of an acquired taste in a way. For example, Nights into Dreams, considered to be the flagship game for the system by many, and another game where the Japanese version is very playable by the way, is a really abstract game that can take some getting used to, but what a game it is once it clicks. Anyways, whatever your thoughts may be sure to leave them down in the comments below, and I will see ya in the next video.